a Zoom?
No, it's just a recording that we'll share later.
Excellent. So, hi everyone. More than a decade ago, I began writing my doctoral dissertation on the Israeli military government over the Palestinian Arab citizens of Israel. When I mentioned this in small talk, 90% of the Israelis younger than 50, and almost all Americans, and Americans that care about Israel, that know a few things, they would all say, huh? What do you mean the military government? You mean the occupation? And then I'd say, no. The military government over the Arabs in Israel. You know, those with the citizenship, the blue identity card like I have. They were also, until December 1966, under military rule. And then I get another, interesting. And that would be that. Now I can't blame them for my interlocutors for not knowing about this. I did not know about this. I had to study, I had to enroll in university, to Israel Studies program and take a course in order to know this. If I studied biology or anything, I would have no idea.
You're talking about the ממשל הצבאי?
Yeah.
Okay.
See? So.
Just to translate. The question was, are you talking about the military government? And the answer was yes.
So I started the whole academia thing because of my personal experiences. I wouldn't say traumas, but I wasn't the one doing the trauma. But my experiences as an infantry soldier in the West Bank at the height of the Second Intifada. And a lot of what I was doing was implementing movement restrictions of Palestinians in the West Bank. That's a lot of what I was doing. And then I wanted to study the history to understand how do we get into this situation, because the occupation was crappy, didn't like it, and how do we get there? And I found out, right, that as a society we've been doing this from day one, right, from the very inception of the state. And what's going on? This is continual. So this realization, in my eyes, it made Zionism fit very well into the kind of academic atmosphere, even in Israel, in the early 2000s, not to mention here. Zionism, in most scholarship, it's animated as a sort of ethno-national ideology that has an unchanging core, and it pushes its adherents, that's how people conceptualize Zionism, towards the creation and maintenance of a Jewish state, like the one that was created in 48, as if this is the plan, and this is where the thrust is from the beginning. And what does the Jewish state mean? It means that it's a state that will perpetually subordinate its non-Jewish subjects. And that's the kind of Israel I grew up in the 80s, right? All I knew was that we are controlling the West Bank, we are controlling Gaza, there are settlers there that have citizenship, and they live next to Palestinians that don't have citizenship. Any withdrawal from territory of the state or moderation of the level of oppression applied to Palestinian Arabs required, according to this way of thinking, I'm not saying that this is Zionism, but this way of thinking of Zionism, it requires to disinvest from Zionism, to dilute Zionism with pragmatism or humanism, liberal Zionism, but it's not Zionism. You have to add something to it. Or you could abandon Zionism, because it's very popular to be post-Zionist at the time. And in this framework, I noticed that there is a certain article of faith that was very important for my kind of left-of-center house, Mapainik house, that was becoming increasingly unpopular, like the left-of-center, the Israeli left. And that was that the 1967 war mattered. I grew up in an academic environment that did a lot of work, and that was good academic work, but a lot of it was to show the continuity before 67 and after 67. And this is where right-wing Zionists and anti-Zionists seem to agree that the post-1967 settlement movement in the occupied territories is a direct and seamless continuation of a core of Zionist logic or ideology. Everyone on the same page? So if Zionism has this essence, and if that essence can be summed up with one concept, right, that of what is Zionism, that could save space in picket signs, or if you're trying to make elaborate arguments, you can get to the point faster. You don't even need rigorous historical explanations for why Zionists did the things they did. And if that's the case, if a term could be used, then colonialism was the obvious candidate. Colonialism. After all, there's a long tradition of associating Zionism with colonialism that predates 1948. And we know that Zionism never fit well with this, seamlessly with this concept, because Zionists did not come to Palestine to claim it in the name of an empire. But on the other hand, Zionism was dependent for a good chunk of time, a formative time, on the most colonial of all empires, the British Empire. We know that. And also, you can say that Israel is its own self-image as a bastion of Western civilization. It fits well with the idea that Israel is almost like a colony of the United States. And yet, it doesn't fit perfectly with the colonial model. It's a sovereign state, more or less. Yet by the time I started working on my dissertation in the early 2010s, the term settler colonialism started emerging. And it starts to take traction. It was used as a way to kind of fill this gap, okay? Colonialism doesn't fit. Maybe settler colonialism, that makes more sense. You could see this happening in adaptations for dissertations that were written in the 2000s. Once they become books in the 2010s, everywhere that colonialism appeared, now there's settler colonialism when describing Zionism. I won't bore you with the list of publications that starts from 2005 and the kind of, it ends, I think, this list with Rashid Khalidi's 100-Year War that has settler colonialism in the subtitle of the book. And that is, Rashid Khalidi is such an important scholar. And, settler colonialism arrived. That's the concept. That's how to understand Zionism. Put a pin a second in my story with my relationship with Zionism, settler colonialism, and the military government. We'll return to that. I'm sure you're in great suspense. But since the early 2010s, the term seemed to replace colonialism as the ultimate shortcut to explain Zionism. You see it in syllabi, in Palestinian activist solidarity speak, initially on campuses and then everywhere else. And Rashid really sealed the deal. Zionism equals settler colonialism. I'd say it's almost hegemonic in academia. Now, what is this settler colonialism that Zionism is indicted with? That's not entirely clear at all. It's obviously a worldview that pits Jews against Palestinians. Sometimes this accounts for dehumanization that Jews do to Palestinians, a sense of superiority or supremacy. Sometimes it accounts for the segregationist bent that you see in Israel. At times it accounts for genocide and maybe fantasies of displacement. It is implicated in the need to settle in Eretz Israel. And, Israel has settlers. So it's building settlements. It also occupied territory. It controls population without incorporating it into its citizenry. That's something colonial. So there's colonialism in Israel-Palestine, and there's settlers in Israel-Palestine. So there you have it, settler colonialism. A colonialism that has settlers. That's more or less how we consider things. Now, this conception of settler colonialism as a type of colonialism really colored the reactions to 10/7 in American academia and in activism. The Gaza Strip and its environs were immediately cast as the shores of Algiers. The Israelis in the kibbutzim and towns were the Pied Noir, and Hamas was the FLN. The Harvard student letter from October 9th, which colored so much of the perception of American academia and students and what's going on, not that it was the only thing that was going on, but that colored a lot of the perceptions, mentioned that the coming days will require a firm stand against colonial retaliation. So colonial, settler colonialism, always interchanging and meaning one as a type of the other. What's going on here? What do we have here? So here's my diagnosis. Ironically, the Team Israel folks who reject any comparison between Israel and other settler colonial cases, they share Team Palestine's misunderstanding of this concept. The two sides don't understand what this concept can do in the same way. Both sides, what's at stake here? Both sides understand that colonialism is bad, right? And that its dissipation from the globe was just. It's good that there is there's any colonialism on earth. So the stakes are, therefore, that if Zionism is settler colonialism, and if settler colonialism is just a type of Zionism, if settler colonialism is a type of colonialism, then Israel should go the way of past colonial endeavors. It should no longer exist. So the pro-Israel people will fight fiercely for denying any comparability, and the anti-Israel, those are fine with it because it says that Israel needs to go needs to fundamentally change at the very best. Now, of course, you're free to think about settler colonialism in this way. You're free to understand that the category is a type of colonialism that has settlers, and it should go. You're also free to think about Israel that way. As far as I'm concerned, you could be people that think Israel should be erased from the globe. But I want to argue that this understanding or misunderstanding of what settler colonialism is not only inflames campus rhetoric, but it hampers our ability to conduct rigorous scholarship on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And tragically, this conceptual mess also, I think, hampers our ability to imagine an end to this conflict that does not involve the total defeat or victory of either side. Okay, so if everybody has settler colonialism so wrong, what's the right way of looking at settler colonialism? And here's where the one slide that I should have maybe insisted on, but never mind. Never mind. So let's understand as colonialism and settler colonialism, not as a derivative of the other. Let's look at it as two ideal types on opposite ends of the spectrum, like furthest away. And I would say that this spectrum are the vectors of capitalist expansion on the globe. How this mode of production, as Marx would say, but how did a certain type of human relationship around capital and certain types of regime of the nation state, how did that spread over the globe? So you have Europe conquering places, and you've had Europeans creating new Europes in other parts. And these are modes of something similar, but they are on opposite ends. Now, since this is a spectrum, and since Zionism should conform to the standards of the historical discipline, it it moves on that spectrum. Everything is in between. The spectrum is conceptual. You can't really say, it is 30% here and 70%. You can't quantify these things. This is a way to conceptualize. And what I'm saying that Zionism is settler colonialism, it's more of saying that Zionism is just closer to the settler colonial end of that spectrum than it is closer to the colonial one. But it's somewhere in the middle, and that changes with contingency, with circumstances. Yes?
I was just, first of all, I wanted to ask if you want to hear questions at the end or during the talk.
If there's something you don't understand, if you're having problems following the argument, then please stop me. But because you're probably not the only one. But if it's like burning, because a lot of the burning issues will be answered. I'm setting everything up and then. Okay.
I don't know. Tell me if it's comprehension quick to answer or not. But
yeah.
I'm not sure I got the difference between settler colonialism and ecology.
We will get to there.
Okay.
But understand these things as on opposite ends of the spectrum. Okay. Settler colonialism is not colonialism. An ideal type of colonialism, you could have missionaries, soldiers, administrators, business people, and even settlers. But the thing they have in common is that they all serve an expanding empire, an empire that expands its borders. On the other hand, settler colonists may originate as emissaries of an empire, but what distinguishes them, what moves them from to the other side of the spectrum, is a detachment, a sense of detachment from the place they from the place they come from, and a certain sense of becoming reconstituted as something new in the place they arrive at. Think about it. What flag is the person leaving that part of the world to another part of the world is carrying? If he's carrying the same flag as the metropole, then he's a colonialist. If he switches flags, at the beginning of the trip, at the middle of the trip, or even when he gets there, but then he switches flag to an independent state, then he's a settler colonial. They develop unique sovereign claims that are separate from the imperial center and in tension with who's ever there, whoever they encounter. Now, the most common claim that I get that's tossed at me at this point is that Zionism never had an imperial metropole. So it's not like that. But according to the way I animate these two concepts, yes. So the fact that Zionism never had this one metropole makes it even closer to the settler colonial type. The fact that there's no metropole indeed makes it incompatible with colonialism. That's almost how I started this conversation. But it makes it closer to settler colonialism. So every time someone throws that as Zionism cannot be settler colonial because there's no metropole. No, that is actually a reason why it's settler colonial. That actually makes it even closer to the settler colonial ideal type, which again, no case adheres to. Another key difference between colonial and settler colonial movements lies in the relationship they form with the people they encounter in the country they arrive at. They're not immigrants. They don't wish to assimilate with whoever is there, but they also tend to avoid mastering them. The late Australian scholar Patrick Wolfe summarized the difference between colonial and settler colonial relationships in a crude but succinct way. Whereas colonialism is premised on the exploitation and control of indigenous peoples, settler colonialism is premised on indigenous erasure or elimination. Colonialists exploit the natives to extract natural and human resources and direct them towards the metropole. That's why Paris and London are so beautiful. They really sucked the living life of the entire world. And a classic example would be British rule in India, where Indians' labor and powers of consumption, they could buy stuff from the metropole, enrich the East Indian Company and then the British treasury. Exploitation of subordinate nations requires violent subjugation. But colonial powers have no interest in bringing natives to the brink of annihilation. Because if there's no one to exploit, what use is there for a colonial empire? If there's no one there, who's gonna enrich your project? In contrast, settler colonists wish to replace the native population, to become the native population. They often inflict violence upon them in ways that drastically reduce their number and ability to hold land. Wolff's logic of native elimination or erasure that's at the heart of the settler colonial project, it explains acts of genocide and ethnic cleansing that occurred in many settler colonial cases, and the United States being a prominent example. But here's the kicker. Native erasure also manifested in ways that Wolff, and it's not the best term, but I'm using him, broadly placed under the category of assimilation. There's another way to eliminate natives, via assimilation. And assimilation itself is a very broad category. It is more or less the political, cultural, and even biological absorption of the native populations into the settler body politique. Indigenous assimilation is an effective means for settler colonial consolidation of dealing with the native problem, because it attenuates the natives' resistance to the settler project. Someone is at the door. That was yeah.
Good timing.
When settlers and indigenous people become somehow joined politically, when they see each other as compatriots, the latter, the indigenous people, they forfeit their claim to exclusive ownership of the land. And when you say, oh, now this land is yours as much as it's mine, when you're in a political scenario where that happens, then you're actually forfeiting your indigeneity, right? Of course, that doesn't mean you've stopped becoming, that you've erased centuries of indigenous existence. But on a political level, your indigeneity means nothing, or it means a lot less, because the settlers have the same thing. So this assimilation that occurs in settler colonial cases, you can't have that in colonialism. Because colonialism is a regime that's premised on difference and hierarchy, right? How can you even justify exploiting another nation? You conceptualize them as inherently inferior, unable to assimilate with us, okay? Or their assimilation is continuously postponed. But here, like the Woody Guthrie song goes, this land is your land, this land is my land, this land was made for you and me. That's a settler colonial. It's everywhere. It's in this culture, right? So equipped with these insights, let's see how settler colonialism helps us, because it's an analytic category. It's not like you can look at the Israelis and look under the hood and see, oh, settler colonialism. That's what the dial says, right? It's only if it helps you to explain what we've seen through history that these categories have actual meaning, right? And equipped with these insights, let's see how settler colonialism helps explain chapters of Zionist history. For instance, Ze'ev Jabotinsky. No one can suspect he's a member of Students for Justice in Palestine, right? You'd agree with me. He's an early adopter of the settler colonial prison that I am employing, in the way I'm employing, right? And he uses that to predict that the Palestinian Arabs will not welcome the Zionist project in Palestine. He understood this in his seminal, The Iron Wall. Sophie's very much aware of the Iron Wall because it's the first thing I talk about in Hesket Oslo.
Fascinating.
But it is the algorithm of Zionism, okay? And he understood that regardless of the exceptionalities of Zionism, and there's a lot of exceptionalities, not every settler movement can look at thousands of years of culture and religion and say, we have an affiliation with this land. Not every settler movement has a small contingency, but an actual one among the indigenous people, because there were Jews when the Zionists came. There were Jews in the land. And those Jews, while they were, of different communities, but there was a co-understanding of they're Jews, we're Jews, we're somehow tied, right? That is very unique about Zionism. There's a lot of other stuff that's unique. But regardless of those exceptionalities, that doesn't alter the fact that when European Jews decided that the solution to their problems was elsewhere on the globe, they faced the same fundamental problems of all other settler colonial projects. The land that they wanted was not empty. It's the same problem. It doesn't deny Jewish connection to the land, but it points out that this connection still does not make history, doesn't make reality disappear. So like all settlers, Zionists consistently developed visions that would diminish the native problem. So, by the way, that argument I just made, that Zionism faced the same problem as other settler movements, is the argument of the Iron Wall. It's not my argument. This is how Jabotinsky says we're going to have to be very vigilant and we will not be able to find compromise anytime soon because in other cases that are similar to ours, this never happened. So, an aspiration for the Zionist visions. So there were always an aspiration for Jewish demographic superiority, whether through willful Palestinian Arab emigration or by force. And it accompanied Zionism for ages, and we see it today, okay? I'm not denying that. But settler colonial analysis can also explain forgotten Zionist integrationist drive and a preponderance to envision inclusive democratic regimes. A one democratic state solution, if you will. In his essential 2018 book, and I highly recommend that book, Beyond the Nation State, Dmitry Shumsky demonstrated that until the late 20s and even up until 36, the Zionist mainstream formulated a succession of binational and federative arrangements such as Jewish autonomy under the Ottoman Empire, a binational state, a Jewish state federated with a larger Arab state, a Jewish state that's part of the British Commonwealth, different cantons, different autonomous arrangements within one state. And all these paths would have spelled the erasure of a distinct and hostile indigenous entity by guaranteeing political equality between Arabs and Jews. So these visions of binationalism, which are now considered post-Zionist or maybe even radical, they were part of Zionist imagination. So Zionism as settler colonialism and settler colonialism as a type of colonialism, that requires us to ignore these one-state Zionist visions. We have to describe them, they're marginal, deceptive, conspiratorial, that the settler colonial definition that I offer, on contrast, allows us to explain these visions, these programs as authentic, structural, and congruent with the historical circumstances of early Zionism. Okay, this is what people thought needs to be done, could be done. Now, the reason Zionist settlers lean towards integrative or inclusive visions, again, it's not their inherent liberalism or the beauty of Judaism. It had to do with the fact that compared to other settler colonial cases, the indigenous population they encountered was strong. That is why there's this envisioning of coexistence. Until 1917, with the Balfour Declaration, and we had a British activist remind us about Balfour's and the British involvement in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict last week with the defacement or effacement of his portrait. Until the British Empire adopted Zionism, Zionists could not have imagined militarily defeating the Palestinians. So they had to support political frameworks that could potentially appeal to the Palestinian Arabs. I mean, if you're coming to a country and you're that weak and you're not supported by a grand empire, and you say, oh, by the way, 50 years from now, we're going to banish 80% of you in what's going to be called a Nakba. That's unviable. You can't have, that's not a program for a political movement that is interested in acquiring supporters, right? One that sentences its adherence to a bloody clash with the majority population of the country. So I have to imagine, no, we'll get along, we'll be equal. They had to formulate things that were potentially they could appeal to Palestinian Arabs. By nationalism, it's much more palatable than ethnic cleansing, of course, but it can nevertheless be ascribed to a drive, in Wolf's words, of indigenous elimination that's present in all settler societies. And it's very hard to imagine in 2024 how Jewish-Arab equality was part of a Zionist political logic, no less than fantasies of Jewish ethno-homogeneity. Right? These things, I'm not saying it's the exclusive tendency or theme, but it is on par with the exclusionary. Okay. Let's return finally to the military government, where I was starting. I don't study pre-48 Israel. Israel's 1948 birth, through the formal detachment from the British colonial empire, there's the detachment from there, raising of a new flag, and the displacement, the pushing of 700,000, 750,000 Palestinians. That's a quintessential settler colonial moment. We can all understand that, right? But once Zionists created Israel as an almost mono-ethnic Jewish state, that's when binationalism completely disappears from Zionist agenda, right? Once that happens, there's no vested interest among the Zionists to return to some more equitable solution. But there are still Palestinian Arabs, 140, 150,000, within the Jewish state. Now, if you're me, and you're entirely under the sway of this conceptualization of Zionism as an ethno-national movement, and you're thinking about settler colonialism as a type of colonialism, so it seems to make perfect sense to place the Palestinian Arabs under martial law that essentially nullified the citizenship they got very reluctantly from the state. That makes sense, right? If Zionism is this thing of domination and colonialism and ethno-supremacy, then it makes sense to put a military government even though he gave them citizenship. But then I delved into the history of this martial law, and I could not ignore, I just couldn't ignore it as much as it didn't fit. I could not ignore the simple fact that citizenship provided a discursive legal and political infrastructure for Arabs and Zionist Jews to strive for more civic equality. I could not ignore that Palestinian Arab citizens recognized the Zionist state and conducted nonviolent struggles to improve their lot. I could not ignore that with time, prominent Zionists turned on the military government and claimed that it was unnecessary and even harmful for the desired integration of the Arab citizens. And I could not ignore the fact that it ended. Like, how do you explain that, right? If Zionism is colonialism and this thing seems to fit, then why did it give up on a colonial measure? I could not ignore that from the mid-1950s, Israeli governments gradually eased the military government's restrictions and then canceled it in December 66. The integration of Palestinian Arabs into Israeli society constantly left them at a subordinate status and always a suspect population. That's true. But my come to Jesus moment was when Lorenzo Veracini, an important scholar of settler colonialism, happened to visit UCLA, and I happened to be there. That's how everything is so. So he told me the military government is not what is settler colonial about early Israel. Its dismantling is what is congruent with settler colonialism. The fact that it disappeared, that it dissipated. The protracted and partial integration of Palestinian Arab citizens into Israeli society, the improvement in services, their improved health statistics, their rising rates of college graduates. None of these, by the way, suggest that Israel is a model liberal democracy. Don't get me wrong. But those are nevertheless congruent with a settler colonial pattern. With time, Palestinian Arabs in Israel assumed also a sense of Israeliness. They adopted Israeliness. They used Arab Israeli, what many of them are very reluctant to use today. They used Arab Israeli as a way to identify and as a way to claim rights in the settler state. We are Arab Israeli. It's an indication that what we have here is a more settler colonial relationship than a colonial one that is premised on constant oppression. Now, it is worth pointing out that if Israel is indeed a settler colonial state, then it is as legitimate or illegitimate as some of the states that are home to its fiercest critics. And while anti-Israel activists in this country may support their own states engaging in policies of reconciliation and compensation with their respective indigenous communities, in that sense, the radical anti-Israel here may be consistent because they are also, there's a big overlap with people that are for Native American rights. But those steps of reconciliation and compensation ultimately amount to assimilating indigenous peoples in the multicultural tapestry under the settler state. Things like land acknowledgements, you all know what I'm talking about? Things like land acknowledgements are settler colonialism at its highest form, not its negation. And yet, even if you think these gestures are empty, or you think that they are important, these things are, we should do them and they have value, and indigenous people think they have value. Doesn't matter. We still need to ask why Zionists and Palestinians never entered that reconciliatory phase. Because we're not there, obviously, right? So now I'd like to give you a quick survey of Israel-Palestine conflict with the definition of settler colonialism that I use, which is distinct from colonialism. And I think this will help us to explain what we are what have we been witnessing in the last 60 years, without casting Zionists with essential traits. And this will explain why we didn't go the way of the US, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and we did not accommodate the remaining indigenous minority within the settler society. And this explanation requires us to return to 1967 as an important historical turning point in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. You don't have to think that way, but if you're using settler colonialism, that returns to 67 as something changed there. Now, following the June 67 war, Israel suddenly controlled a larger territory with a much larger Palestinian population. Now, during the first post-war election cycle, 1969, Israeli voters could choose between the right under Begin, who called for the annexation, settlements, and naturalization of the Palestinian population. Begin, 69. The Labour Party wanted to keep the territories, didn't annex them entirely, left them in this kind of middling state, but rejected, and Dayan was adamant on rejecting the idea of naturalizing, giving citizenship to the people in the territories. The Israeli public gave Labour 56 seats in the Knesset, and the right got 26. By keeping the territories, not granting citizenship to its inhabitants, implanting privileged Jewish Israeli settlers, they had citizenship. The Israeli occupation began to resemble past cases of imperial control over colonial dependencies. We're moving the spectrum. Zionism is moving on the spectrum. It's a regime that's premised on ethnic supremacy and labor exploitation. Anyone who grew up in Israel in the 80s remembers that Palestinian workers were everywhere. And up until 10/7, there was a period where there were many. Labor exploitation of subalterns. It's a more colonial regime than a settler colonial one. Demographically, the growth of the Palestinian population in the territories and its increased hostility towards Israel. There's more Palestinians, there's more indigenous people, and these indigenous people are less and less inclined to see the legitimacy of the Israeli state. That is the opposite of elimination. Whatever were the intentions of Israel in the territories, if it wanted to make the Arabs disappear, the actual regime that was set in place did the opposite. It went the other way, more and more hostile. That's a bad settler colonialism. A good thing, right? I'm not saying that. We have more of a colonial regime after 67 than a settler colonial one. Now, both pre- and post-1967 Israeli governments encouraged Judaization, Yehud, of land via settlements. But the kibbutzim, who settled on Palestinian lands in the 1950s, were committed, at least in principle, to ending the military government. They were, Mapam, the party that was most affiliated with that movement, was the first Zionist party to go 100% against the military government. They were adamant on honoring the promise of Israeli citizenship for Arabs. Now, in contrast, the settlers in the occupied territories, they've never been particularly troubled by the inferior political status of their Palestinian neighbors. So we can say that the post-1967 Zionist settlers are more like the Algerian Pied Noir than they are like the European populations of Australia and America. They are more colonial settlers, the ones in the territories, than settler colonists. Think about it. When they leave Petah Tikva or Be'er Sheva towards Gaza or the West Bank, what flag are they carrying? They are carrying the Israeli flag over the territories. They're not. In the margins, there's Medinat Yehuda. I don't know if you've heard about it. In the margins, there are radical people who want a new entity, but those are the margins. The bulk of the settler project is one that expands Israeli control over an indigenous population and does not eliminate that population. In 1987, 20 years into Israel's colonial-like control of the territories, a popular anti-colonial uprising in the form of the First Intifada breaks. And, like other anti-colonial mutinies, it lowers the profitability of the colonial project. Everything that's gained from the cheap labor, from the buying power of the Palestinians. Last week I wrote an article. The UNRWA money that goes into the refugees in Gaza enters the Israeli market, right? All of these things that Israel is gaining from controlling this and this million Palestinians becomes less profitable because you have to invest more funds and material resources to subdue this uprising. And if there was ever an incentive for Zionists to continue indefinitely with the colonial relationship, the Palestinians and the territories in the First Intifada made Zionists think again. The Oslo process that came at the heels of the First Intifada you can understand it as an attempt to get Zionism back on a more settler colonial trajectory and abandoned or decolonized, or abandoned the colonial relationship with the Palestinians in the territories. An explicit motivation of the Zionist left for going forward with the Oslo process, it evinced, you see within it a logic of native assimilation, elimination. Not through ethnic cleansing, they weren't going to kick the Palestinians out. Not through assimilation, they were not going to give them citizenship, but via a redrawing of the borders in a way that would place most of the Palestinians outside of Israeli control and responsibility. That's how you eliminate. It would have been decolonialism. It would have been a movement towards the settler colonial end of the spectrum. Not coincidentally, those were the high times of, those were good times of relationship between Jews and Arab citizens at the time. There's this kind of movement away from the territories and a more openness towards the Palestinian Arabs in Israel, right? Their project, they are eliminated via assimilation. Oslo's collapse in the year 2000 meant a resurgence of colonial domination, this time with harsher levels of Israeli oppression and more brutal militant resistance, not like the one in 1988-87. In 2005, Israel evacuated the Gaza Strip, but retained substantive control over it, while in the West Bank, it managed to subdue the Palestinian resistance with the aid of a Palestinian authority. That's almost like a comprador class. We have so many cases in which foreign nations have controlled nations with someone there as a collaborator. For 2 decades, Israel successfully kept Palestinians in a colonial matrix while keeping resistance to manageable levels. But nothing lasts forever. The 10/7 Hamas massacre of Israeli towns and villages surrounding the Gaza Strip, its scale and its tactics, they suggest a desire to erase all Zionist traits in Palestine. Right? I'm not saying that I can enter the minds of the Hamsawis, but what they did feels like it's more than just the territories, right? But it failed. If that was the goal, then it failed. The defeat of Israel on that day and the international dynamic that was created after the attack, it may make Israel choose to abandon the colonial patterns of interaction with the Palestinians. So in that sense, I don't know what they meant to do, but this could actually dislodge us from our controlling territories. However, if a return to more settler colonial patterns like Oslo, now there's competition for another settler colonial pattern, one of Palestinian ethnic cleansing. That might be the way to go. Not that I would advocate for that, but that is what seems to be simmering. I'd say boiling or spilling over. And even genocide in Gaza Strip. Now, the daily statements made by top Israelis and the scale of death, destruction, and hunger, they point in that direction. And let's hope and do all we can that Israel does not go down this particular settler colonial path. I think you want to stop here, or I think we had the next part is kind of really aimed at professors who I'm trying to impress, but it doesn't. So I think basically, you know, I'm trying to understand to put some dispassion in a very passionate situation, and understand that we are witnessing here the violence that erupts from a colonial situation, but that's very much implicated in a wider settler colonial context, and we don't know where one begins and one ends, and we're kind of stuck. But at the end of the day, it's going to have to be a settler colonial solution. That we stay, if Israel stays, then that's definitely the case, and we have to end our hierarchy and control of the Palestinians in order to create a dynamic in which both sides see each other as of the land. Yes.
Are we in a dead end?
What?
Are we in a dead end?
And never. There's never a dead end. There's always a dynamic that could happen. I can tell you that I was before once Trump came to power in 20, I thought this cannot be. We cannot continue. Like I said, colonialism doesn't exist in the world. It exists in the West Bank and Gaza Strip. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that the occupation is the most, up until now, but the occupation is the most brutal form of regime in the world. I think that being a citizen of Bashar al-Assad might be worse than being a subject of the Israeli state. That might be the case. But it's the only place that's administered like this on the globe. The Western Sahara occupation, yeah, but the Sahrawis have access to Moroccan citizenship. Tibet, China, Crimea, Russia, right? Israel is the one place that there's this hierarchical control. And I thought this has to end at a certain point. And then Trump was elected, and suddenly the empire, right? Suddenly a baseline commitment to liberal principles, which was never acted upon all over the globe, right? But like in this, you know, the United States even has made the United Nations. It has its rise meant the decrease in power of the colonial empires, France and Britain. And I thought that this moment could end. And then there was Trump, whose programs for what to do with the conflict were prescription to perpetuate this hierarchical situation where they won't have a state, or we can call it a state, but it won't be a state. They'll live, they'll perpetually live. It's not eliminating them, but they will have be in some sort of permanent subordinate status. And I thought that at a certain point, I thought, well, maybe this is the world we're living in now. We're beyond the post-World War II. Kingdoms, monarchies, hierarchies can form indefinitely, and we've entered a new phase. And then the Palestinians came, and then we have Biden, and we have a regime, we have an administration that's a bit more determined to ending this form of, I don't know if this regime lasts. I don't know if Biden, if this administration lasts, and I don't even know if the American regime will last. So there's what I'm saying is it's not only up to us.
I think you missed one point in the analysis.
Probably missed 20, but
Shalat Tzvai, the government ruling from 48 to 66, almost to 67 war.
Yeah, December 66.
Yeah, was basically necessitated, because I grew up in the period, by security reasons more than exploitation of the citizens. They were not viewed as having any resources or any skill. Yes, they were getting some labor jobs, and then many of them now became physicians and pharmacists and whatever. But the political rationale was that because their families on the other side of the borders,
Right.
and they don't share the Zionist return and the biblical claim on the land, so there may be security danger, like fifth column. This was the fear.
Yeah.
Though history proved there were not many spies among them and so forth, but this was the fear initially that necessitated it.
So, like, I can go on and on about this because this is my dissertation. I can tell you that in an interview in the early '60s, Peres says the whole thing with the military government. There is a certain sense of security thinking in Zionist thought that says if you hold the land then you are secure. But it wasn't. The fear wasn't the actual people. It was because you controlled militarily the land, then you could make sure there won't be any squatters and you can keep the land. That's what Peres says. That is the meaning of security. There was a lot of infiltration in the 50s. But what's interesting is why they abolished it. Okay, because if you look at the reason, the rationale that Zionists like Begin, like Samech Izar, like Michael Asaf from Mapai, but also, and of course, all the Mapamniks, their rationale wasn't, we are nice and democratic, we are good, loving Jews. No. The rationale was, they are a threat, they are a potential fifth column, and the best way to address that is to give them many rights as possible.
It's not true.
Rights and equality. More equality, more services. That is the way to handle their organic ties with Israel's enemies. And so it shows that integration, the Israelis in the 50s, they weren't going, I'm a settler colonist. Now at this point, I'm supposed to integrate the indigenous people. Let's do that. No one's working on that level of consciousness. But when they move towards more integration, they view it as an interest, not as some sort of favor they're doing. Yeah, some people say, some people use the moral argument, but it really is secondary to this is how to address this problem of people that we inherently suspect their loyalty. But if you give them rights, it's how liberals think, right? Wrong, right, wrong. If you give them rights, give them equality, if they have some buy-in into the system, then they'll be fine.
They're skin in the game.
Exactly. Yeah, she was raising her hand.
I have a few questions, and I may have missed it because I missed the beginning. But so you're applying the settler colonial lens, fine. I'm curious how this relates. For example, so India, Pakistan were formed at the same time by the same colonial empire.
The withdrawal of the same colonial.
Withdrawal, but also withdrawal of the British from, what had been the Ottoman Empire. So and you have that kind of ethnic cleansing, ethnic division, that Pakistan is formed as an ethno-religious state where Hindus are not welcome, and vice versa. And I guess how do you, so you're applying a settler colonial model in one place, but not in another, in a completely different historical period. So when Israel is exactly a settler colonial like the US, Canada, Australia, but by a difference of 200 to 400 years, it's kind of a different situation too. And so I'm curious if we don't see Israel-Palestine as unique and decontextualized from the rest of the world, what would happen if we look more broadly into the geopolitical
I'm not sure.
of Israel?
I'm not sure I understand the question, Mark. So, I mean...
So do you say, Israel is just like the settler colonial
No,
of the U.S. is a little bit problematic when you're not taking that historical context under which it was formed. So I
Which
don't
was-
dispute you.
What colonialism?
Yeah.
British colonialism?
Yes. and that it's formed at a particular time when the whole model around the globe of the empire is kind of pulling back and creating these pseudo ethno-national states. So you have the problem of
But
plurality in Indonesia, but again, different because of the
Zionism
production of the
precedes the British Mandate. It precedes 1948, precedes the British
course it
Mandate,
does.
right? And it is a movement of people from one part of the globe to another for their sake.
Wait, I have another question though, because within all of this model, one thing that you're doing is, it sounds to me like a complete erasure of two groups. One is the Mizrahi Jews and how we think about them. And second is the Palestinian Arabs themselves. Like, what agency do they have? What
Oh.
role do they
That's
have?
that's a very good question. What agency did they have? Remember, I told you weren't here, but I said about the dominance of binational solutions, right, in early Zionism. Those solutions dissipate. Why?
The British Empire?
Nope. I mean,
They grew up in numbers.
no. The Palestinians said no.
It was a revolt of 35.
There was a 29. Like Jabotinsky predicted, the Palestinians were not in a position to forfeit 50% of sovereignty, right, in any binational arrangement. Not to mention partition. They were not. They did not seem reasonable for that to happen. So yes, there is agency of the. It's inherently a relational prism. It's one that beckons us to look at what is the relationship between the people living their country from where they came. Are they controlled by where they came? And what is their relationship with the people they encounter? And if the people they encounter are weak, then or cannot put up a fight, then that would change the character. That's actually what I wanted to say at the end, but I didn't. Like, what I like about this prism is that it's highly critical of Zionism. But it's not highly critical in the sense that you're saying Zionism is bad. Okay? It's highly critical of Zionism because it forces us to look at that Zionism was constituted through the interactions with the indigenous people. It's the fact that the Palestinians didn't disappear, right, that led us towards a nation state, a model of a nation, an ethno-national state. Not just because this is internal to us, to Jews, to always want a state. It's because the conditions in Palestine required it.
In which context did
Also,
indigenous
some other
people
people can ask
disappear?
questions?
Yeah, please.
So, it's interesting to think about who's indigenous, right? And you noted that the connection, so doesn't fit exactly the model because there were always Jews, but even the ones that were not there prayed every year to go back to Jerusalem. And you can also go back and ask who's really indigenous, like thousands of years earlier.
Right.
The Jews were there and they were dispersed, and these tribes arrived and claimed that being the indigenous people.
Right.
So are there more than one indigenous group here?
There is no such thing as an indigenous group. As a historian, I'm using this term analytically, right? The indigenous are the people that are already there and are not very much interested in a kind of overhaul of the regime. The settlers are the people that are mostly not there. They might have a contingency that's beginning to form, but they want to change the nature, the political relationship in the land, right? That is what indigenous. Now, the fact, again, I can, as a historian, I don't have the capability to tell you who is indigenous or a settler in the sense that who is allowed, should be in the land, and who shouldn't be in the land. That is a very kind of normative, almost essential. You're looking for some sort of, I don't know, mystical, transcendental relationship between certain populations and lands. I can tell you that there were Jews in Palestine, Israel, all these years, that there was a connection, I can tell you, but I can't tell you whether that actual history makes that land belong to the Jews as an indigenous population. So when I'm saying indigenous, when I call the Palestinian indigenous people, it's only because they are there first and they don't like the project of people coming from the outside. But there's no value judgment. There's no value judgment of it's their land on an essential level, right? I mean, who's indigenous to anywhere in this world? The person with the bigger stick, right?
But you know what really I'm struggling with, with all this colonialism or settler colonialism is that it equates what, the projects in the US, that people moved here, had no connection, or to Australia or to Canada, and it equates it with what happened.
Look, if you think that the bond that a Russian Jew has with the land of Israel is somehow more powerful, somehow it is more righteous, the universe is more in sync when that bond is implemented. I'm not saying that's wrong, but I can't say it's right. These are things that, as a scholar, there's no way I can test, there's no way I can quantify and endow with any sort of moral validity to the connection of a Russian Jew coming to Palestine and an Irish coming to Boston. You can say that one is, while he's doing it, he can rely on thousands of years of culture. Fine, that'd be correct. But I can't say, then that is one type of movement from one place to another, and that is a completely different type of movement. No, maybe the Bostonite, as soon as he comes, it's home to him, right? So it's thank you so much for your question, because I've already gave another lecture today, but this was well articulated. And I know now that I have to go to this lecture and really make sure that for people to understand, I'm using all of these categories as analytical categories.
Why can't we have the simplicity of, I'm from Ohio.
Right.
But I've lived in Boston for 40 years.
What, from the Ohio tribe, you are?
The Ohio tribe?
Yeah,
no,
it's
I'm
Ohio is a tribe. You
yeah,
know that?
I'm Russian Jew.
Oh, so maybe you're not from Ohio, right?
Well, right. Okay, that's right. But now I'm from Ohio.
Okay.
And I've come to Boston for 40 years, and
Right.
I consider myself a New Englander.
Right.
Okay, big deal. I'm here. I love it. This is my home. Why can't we let all these people in Israel who are from Russia or Palestine or wherever feel like it's their home? That's the simplicity.
There's
What
no-
is the problem?
That's a great way of forming it. When you moved to Ohio, to Boston, you did not come here as a representative of the Ohioan Empire and wanted to subjugate the Massachusetts people to Ohio.
Right.
On the other hand, what's your name?
Joy.
Joy. You did not come here in the name of joy nationalism, a joy nation, trying to create something new here in Boston, right? The Jews that came from Eastern Europe to Palestine, they came to do something new. Now, it didn't start out with the Nakba. It didn't start out with intentions of Nakba. But it did say it began when the Ottoman Sultan was in control. So at the very least, it said, this country will be a Jewish district of the Ottoman Empire. They came to Palestine to change it. Maybe not radically change it, but to change it in a way that when you move to Ohio, to Boston, you're not doing. And this resistance to this change is what kind of animates the entire system. But
And why
as an Israeli,
why
as an
why
Israeli,
is
just a
so?
second, as an Israeli, I've lived in Israel all my life. It is my home. I see it as my home, right? But I understand that the project that I belong to has not been able to eliminate, like the Americans were able to do.
To do what?
Eliminate, like physically through genocide. We haven't been able to do that, and it's good that we haven't. I'm happy. And we haven't been able to assimilate, and we haven't been able to come to some sort of compromise of splitting the land and living, Eretz Israel will always be Eretz Israel. Palestine will always be Palestine, and sharing that within that same land that we both covet, there'll just be two states. We've not reached that point where the two leaderships, the two sign off on, this is their land too. We haven't gone to that, we haven't been there in that point. Now, Zionism was much more open to recognizing Palestinian indigeneity from the beginning, but that was in the beginning, right? But that doesn't mean it's not essential. That doesn't mean that Zionists have this kind of mind virus that would never allow me to share the land. Or that sharing the land makes me less of a Zionist. No. If it's sharing the land is what makes them recognize me, then we're golden. Yes.
But you want to share the land.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I want to share the land, but you know how much, what the party I voted for, how much mandates it received in the Knesset?
3.5.
It's not even there. Yeah, exactly. So I want to do it, but wait, let's.
You're gonna ask yet question, and maybe I'm just gonna stop the recording so people, it's become a bit.